My guest is Professor Harold Troper, or Hesh Troper, as I call him. Hesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Howard.
You've written a wonderful book, The Defining Decade, about the identity politics in the Jewish community in the 60s, and I want to explore it over 3 different sessions of the show. We'll have one session tonight, and I'll have you come back. But in this, can you set the stage for the 60s and set it in terms of the difference from Massey being Governor General to the change in the next Governor General? Because that seems to change the nature of Canada, or signal the change. Am I right that that's part of your sense of it?
I think that the change from Massey to Vanier was symbolically very important, because, at least for the Jews, because for the Jewish community we went from a Governor General who had a long and very, very sordid relationship to anti-Semitism, even from his days in London as the High Commissioner, and to Vanier, who also was in the Canadian Diplomatic Corps, was Canadian ambassador to France, and during the war, Canadian ambassador to the countries in exile, and was just cut from a very different piece of cloth. In 1959, Massey retired as Governor General, was replaced by Vanier. And it was at that exact moment almost that the Jewish community decided that it wanted to celebrate the anniversary of the first Jewish contact with Canada. And the opening event that they hoped to have was the presentation of a scroll to the Governor General. And the Jewish community was very, very concerned to get this started as early as possible, but they had the Yom Tovim in September. And during the interim, while they were organizing this, the viceregal power shifted from Massey, who was absolutely the wrong person to accept and celebrate the anniversary of Jewish presence in Canada, moving it over to Vanier, who was open, receptive, who had indeed tried very hard during the war years and the pre-war years to get Canada to open itself to the possibility of accepting Jewish refugees. And I think that the shift from Massey to Vanier also represented a kind of shift in the position of Jews in the society, from a marginalized community that was in Canada but really not part of Canada as far as the ruling elite was concerned, to a position where the Jews were part and parcel of the community, or at least moving into the community.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
Because that's one of the major themes in your book, is that the 60s represent that shift in which Jews became not Jews living in Canada, who are citizens of Canada, but not really quite full Canadians, to becoming full Canadians.
Right.
Can you expand on that shift? Because that's a very clear, defining decade. You go from one kind of Jew in Canada to the end of the decade, and you're another kind of Jew in Canada. The Jew we became in Canada, fully Canadian, no
I think
worries
that what
about our
happened, it was not so
Judaism.
much a shift that took place just for Jews. Canada in the late 50s and into the 1960s became part of a larger civil rights and human rights revolution that was taking place across the West. There was, of course, the Black Revolution in the United States that began in the post-war era. There was the Quebec, the Quiet Revolution that began. We were moving towards multiculturalism in this society and so on. And the Jews were very, very much part and parcel of a coalition of liberal groups pushing Canada in that direction, and indeed benefited enormously from the introduction of human rights legislation and so on. And at the same time, I think the society was itself opening up. Immigration, large-scale immigration was coming in from Europe, and the entire society was changing. And the Jews redefined their position in the society, and the society began to open to them. There was still elite anti-Semitism, private clubs, an awful lot of the boardrooms of the country were Judenrein. But this was the decade in which much of that was going to change.
One of the things, and I also get that changes, because it changes for Canada as a whole, is that instead of the Jewish community, and you I think are very clear in the book about this, instead of the Jewish community being seen as Johnny-come-lately Americans who are going to go through the same things as Americans but one generation later, which was the myth. In fact, there was a myth that stretches long past it.
Even to our own time, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you puncture it very deadly. You say, we in fact become really Canadians and Canadian Jews, and not just slowed up Americans. Can you elaborate on that theme that's in your book?
I think that the Canadian political culture is just very different than the American. And the more that the Canadian Jewish community began to move into that society, and indeed individual Jews began to play a more and more important role in that society, then Jews became much more invested, not in a kind of North American Jewish world, but a very, very Canadian Jewish world. And as a matter of fact, one of the arguments I make in the book is that there are, the Canadian Jewish story is very, very much focused around a tale of two cities. More than 80% of all Jews lived either in Montreal or Toronto. And in both cities, the Jews became part and parcel of the political culture of those cities, or were reflective of it. In Montreal, which as I describe as a city of boundaries, ethnic boundaries, the Jewish self-identification as being kind of the third solitude, is very, very much a Canadian kind of phenomenon. The kind of way in which the Jewish community in Montreal organized itself, saw itself, functioned within itself, is unique probably not only in Canada but in North America. And then if you take Toronto, Toronto is this city in which, especially during that time, boundaries were beginning to, you couldn't exactly tell where the boundaries were anymore. This is a city where at the beginning of the 1960s we were already into our second Jewish mayor.
It was Phillips. Givens
was the second. Phillips was the
Givens
was the
was
first.
a real, in the sense, because he spoke Yiddish.
He was a Hebreman.
Whereas Phillips was much more anglicized.
I heard a story about Givens, and it may be an apocryphal story, that he had two secretaries. One was English speaking and one was Yiddish speaking. And he was very, very deeply involved with the Zionist organization at that time. You had a very, very, very public Jewish presence at City Hall. And what was true about Toronto was that by the time you got to Givens, the world knew that he was Jewish. The important thing is that nobody cared he was Jewish, right? That was a very, very important transitional point. I think that, and the fact that very shortly thereafter, Trudeau, on a political level, comes to power, and the Jewish community becomes very, very heavily invested in the kind of way in which Trudeau understood Canada, and the way in which he determined to open up Canada to those who felt themselves marginal until his reign, was central in building a kind of Canadian Jewish consciousness.
Well, he points to his cabinet, the Chief Justice. I mean, you name all the appointments, and the deputy ministers.
Well, there was a very funny story that that Trudeau.
Be brief on it.
Oh, okay. Trudeau was, as many of us would know, was what was the phrase? Colorblind when it came to the admission. He believed in the meritocracy. He only wanted the best person for the job, and because of university education because of a reluctance to use the safety valve of the United States. An awful lot of Jews gravitated into the orbit of Ottawa during those years. But there was a meeting in Ottawa of the Gvurim, the leaders of the community, and they were invited. An arrangement was made to invite them to the Prime Minister's house for some wine. But the deal was absolutely informal, off the cuff, everything off the record, no speeches. And at a certain point, one of the Jewish visitors to the house picked up his wine glass, took a little spork. It says, collected and said, "I wish to make a toast to the Prime Minister." Seemed to be in violation of the agreement, but I wish to toast the Prime Minister for all that he has done for the Jews. And which Trudeau said, "No, I have never, I don't merit such a, no. And then the toaster began to rhyme off one after the other, every Jew, every appointment, at which Trudeau became more and more uncomfortable as the list got longer, and finally he intervened and said, "Yes, that is a lot of Jews, isn't it?" and that was it.
Well, that's it for today, and we're going to have you back. That's Estrober, The Defining Decade. I hope you'll come back for another show, because I have a lot more to talk about.
Thank you.
It's been my great pleasure to bring you another episode of Israel and the Jewish World. We hope you found it informative and interesting. If you have any comments at all, drop us a line about future shows or anything. Remember, we're also looking for new members to support the program. Join now. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'm Howard Edelman. Good night. Until next week.